I'm Steve Vogel. I am the director of the Political Economy program and a professor of political science and political economy here at Berkeley. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event. This event is being presented by the newish Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, or BESI, a Center for Cross-Disciplinary Research in Political Economy at UC Berkeley. BESI works closely with the social science matrix. In fact, they coexist in this space together, very happily, by the way. And so we're very grateful for the support of the matrix for their help in hosting today's event. You may be familiar with BESI's earlier incarnation as the Network for a New Political Economy. N2PE is, as we speak, melting into BESI. We think that that's a happy ending, not a sad one, because BESI is on to even bigger and greater things. We're going to be launching the BESI website soon. It's not quite there yet. For the time being, you can follow BESI on Twitter at BESI_Berkeley. Also wanted to mention a couple upcoming BESI events. On October 3rd, we're going to have a talk by Peter Spiegler, a senior researcher at the New Institute on Political Economy, who's going to focus on his new report co-authored with Chris Hughes on market crafting, which argues for a specifically progressive market crafting vision that can achieve major policy goals in a just and equitable manner. Then just a week later, on October 10th, we will be hosting Simon Johnson from the MIT Sloan School for a talk entitled Power and Progress. This is he'll be talking about his new book, which is co-authored with Karen Asamoglu, where they argue that progress depends on the choices we make about technology, and new ways of organizing production and communication can either serve the narrow interests of an elite or become a foundation for widespread prosperity. Brad DeLong will be our discussant. For the moment, since we don't have a BESI website, you can register on the Social Science Matrix website at matrix.berkeley.edu. Just one word now for our online audience out there. Hello. If you're watching this event remotely, we ask you to submit questions and comments through the Q&A feature through the conversation. And if you're having any AV trouble on Zoom, you can contact us via the chat function. All right. We have an amazing panel for you today. I could eat up all of the time talking about all of their accomplishments. I won't do that. I'm going to try to be very succinct. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order, not the order in which you see these people, but I don't think it's going to be too tricky. We're going to start with Kate Gordon. She has been working on how to achieve a more sustainable economic model that acknowledges the reality of climate change, but also the reality of existing industries, regional geographies and cultures, and workforce skills. She's been at the Apollo Alliance, the Center for American Progress, Center for the Next Generation, where she was the founding executive director of the Risky Business Project and the Paulson Institute. She's also been engaged directly in public service, which hopefully she'll tell us a little bit about today. She was in Governor Gavin Newsom's office as the director of the Office of Planning and Research, as well as senior policy advisor on climate. And most recently, she's been senior advisor to Secretary Jennifer Granholm at the U.S. Department of Energy. Todd Tucker, immediately to my left, is the Director of Industrial Policy and Trade at the Roosevelt Institute. He has been engaging with industrial policy not quite as long as John Zeisman and Laura Tyson, who we'll get to in a moment, but still I think has can make the claim that he was working on it before it got trendy. And has been a leading voice. He's written a lot of really important reports or co-authored with his team at Roosevelt on industrial policy. For example, Industrial Policy and Planning, What It Is and How to Do It Better, which my students have been reading for class last week. In any case, and you know, he's trained as a political scientist, but he's really very close to the pulse of the Biden administration. So I think that's going to make him a particularly vital contributor. You know, he's a key advisor on the issue of industrial policy, which is really becoming a new big thing. So looking forward to hearing from that. Laura Tyson and John Zeisman, I'm going to lump together only briefly, and then they will each get their own introduction. Yeah, that'd be great. Come on up. Come on up. So John Zeisman and Laura Tyson have been working on industrial policy for quite a while. Also strategic trade policy, high-tech sectors, through decades of really important work through the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. And it's not simply that they've been advocating certain industrial policies or strategic trade policies, but really made an intellectual case for how and why and when it makes sense. Not blanket advocacy, but kind of a very nuanced intellectual case for how and why it can be useful, with also some political economic analysis of how and why and when it can be more or less effective. They have a huge array of publications, and I'm going to mention probably one of the more unlikely ones, which is this chapter in this book called Politics and Productivity, where they make some of the arguments about the case for both industrial policies and strategic trade policy, which I sometimes read the news today and I'm like, I think I've heard this before. Some of those who have rediscovered the intellectual case for certain types of policies and certain type of state interventions. This work was done much earlier by the colleagues at Bree. So Laura Tyson is an economist. She's the distinguished professor of the graduate school at the Haas School of Business. She chairs the board of trustees at the Blum Center for Developing Economies. She has been the dean of the Haas School. And she served as the 16th chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors from 93 to 95, the second director of the National Economic Council from 95 to 96 under President Bill Clinton. Among many other publications, she is the author of Who's Bashing Whom? Trade Conflict in High Technology Industries. John Zeisman, her colleague at Bree, I will, true confession, he was my academic advisor. So I sometimes find myself in lecture sounding a little bit like him, but in any case, I think of him as the master of everything. He is a genius at tapping the expertise of the engineering school, the people up the hill, and also Silicon Valley, and kind of engaging with academics, like having kind of fruitful dialogues. So I've been kind of admired his ability to do that for years. His ongoing work covers the implications of platforms and intelligent tools for work, entrepreneurship, and international competition, and the economic challenges and opportunities of climate change and the green economy. So I see somehow I defied my own alphabetical order. I didn't forget Paul. I just forgot the alphabet. Paul Pearson is the John Gross Distinguished Professor of Political Science. He's also, maybe most importantly of all, the director of BESI, Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, leading us on this new adventure. He is the author or co-author of 6 books, an endless list of journal articles. I won't mention all of the books, but just for example, and there's a whole series of really brilliant analyses of American politics, not necessarily happy ones, but very insightful ones, along with Jacob Hacker. For example, Winner Take All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class. In any case, we're very fortunate today to have kind of our ongoing partnership with Roosevelt Institute with Todd Tucker here, and he has agreed to chair the first panel. So I'm going to pass it on to him, and we'll go from there. Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to all of you for being here today, and Amanda and the team for organizing such a great event. We have a little under 3 hours together today with a break in the middle. We're dividing it up just for ease, really, between sort of 2 different panels, but I think our hope is that all of the panelists will kind of engage with each other and engage with you, and also engage with the Zoom audience over the course of the time we have together. This first panel one until the break is focused around comparative political economy insights into U.S. industrial policy. And we have a really excellent team of both theorists and practitioners to share insights here. And what we've asked John, Steve, and Paul to do is to each take about 5 to 10 minutes reflecting on sort of insights from their respective geographic focus of their research on what Asia, Europe, and then of course U.S. historical as well with Paul has to say about this current moment that we find ourselves in, focused around industrial strategy and industrial policy. Then we've asked Kate to take a little bit longer, 10 to 20 minutes, to kind of just share some of her insights as to like the real world, day-to-day, fire drills that accompany trying to execute industrial policy on a scale that we have not seen for the civilian economy in a good many decades, if not ever. So we're really excited to have all of those. The order that we've decided that we've said, I'll stick to the order here. We'll have John start us out with some insights from Europe and from France and how they may apply to the U.S. today or not. Then we'll go to Steve for lessons from Japan and how they might apply to the U.S. today or not. Paul will help put the U.S. in comparative perspective and what are the challenges and opportunities in our ability to design and implement industrial policy. And then, as I mentioned, we'll go to Kate for some really interesting, provocative practitioner reactions. So, John, over to you.
Great pleasure. Steve has been saying to you. That really began with a book called American Industry and International Competition, which really lays out our view of that I think still holds today. At the time, the challenge was Japan, and the question was how to respond to Japanese industrial policy. That era was then followed by the Washington Consensus and neoliberal economic policies. And now we face the question of China, which re-raises a lot of the industrial policy kinds of questions. There's a lot of excellent work that's now being done. Todd, thank you very much. I should mention that not only is the Roosevelt Institute a player in this, but Felicia Wong, the president, was a graduate student here back in the day. So we take fault for all of it. Now, Steve, in particular, has asked me to talk about industrial policy in France and Europe, and I will try and do so briefly, but trying to cover all of that rather quickly is not so simple. So let me simply start by talking first about France and then about Europe. The French case, actually, if we look at it, really involves two pieces. One is the politics of structural change, and then the second is the politics of support for particular sectors. What's interesting about the French case is that French industrial policy after World War II, there was a view widely held in academic and policy circles that France would forevermore be a semi-agricultural kind of economy, that it was impossible to really move into any kind of industrial leadership. Now, the fact was there was then an overt policy of structural change that involved subsidizing the winners and at the same time subsidizing the losers. The point was to put your foot on the brake so that people didn't get all upset and put your foot on the gas so that, in fact, that would move faster. Now, the fact it skidded a little bit was not a big surprise. That story is a long and complicated one. Let's simply say that, in fact, if you tell the whole story, you get involved with the Algerian War, the rise of de Gaulle, and the like. But what's interesting in it is that not only were the subsidies aimed at holding in place and calming those who were going to be discomfited, but in fact they were then caught inside the politics of the Gaullist party, and who in fact which represented the alternative to the communists. So as our colleague Steve Cohen always would say, like a field of grain, the peasants got stood up by politics and mowed down by the market. So, in fact, that was structural change, and it was overt. If you really talk to people, it wasn't just that that's what the policies look like. If you talk to people, they said, oh yeah, that's what we're really consciously trying to do. Structural change, but they went beyond that to particular sectors. And we can't really go into that other than to say that with all the fuss about European industrial policy and high-tech policy, the French succeed in railroads, they succeed in steel, they succeed in aircraft, as Boeing would be the first to point out to us. The fact that they don't do so well in very fast-moving electronics is an interesting question. So it really was a case that where you had stable technology or relatively slow-moving technology, clear targets where there's clear state policies that are legitimate, like what do you do with railroads and so forth. The French did, and the Europeans did very well. So I think there are two lessons from the French case. One is you may want to subsidize the losers, right? I mean, you want to keep them from blowing up the whole game. Now, in fact, that's sometimes hard to, pure economic policy says we shouldn't do things like that, but the reality is the politics of industrial change require it. And structurally, you have to be very selective about the sectors and what you're really targeted at and what you're able to, which kinds of sectors, in fact, are amenable to these policies. Now, the European case, which is the question today, the core question for the US is, will Europe remain relevant? And that really is a crucial question because many of us, I think, would believe that we require a democratic capitalist Europe that's vibrant and whole for our own purposes, our own goals. After World War II, Europe was caught between Russia and the United States, and much of what is now European integration really came about around the question of what to do about Germany, as we all know. First, it was the European Union, and later the euro. I mean, if anyone has any doubt what the euro is really about, was you can't have a unified Germany sitting in the center of Europe that's not deeply tied to the West. I, at one point, had said to somebody on the Bundesbank board, since my way of interviewing people is a little different than many others, is ask a flippant question and see what people will actually say. Was, I mean, what you're really doing is giving the French a seat at the Bundesbank table. And this fellow, who was very serious, looked at me and said, yes. You know, at which point I thought, okay, now we know what's really going on here. But the fact is European industrial policy, really, we can break into the circles around the fact that there was one major policy, which is the Single Market Act, which was the effort to try and create a single market in Europe. Without going into the vast details of that, what's significant for today is a major point of the Single Market Act was to put a limit on the ability of the national governments to subsidize their industries, so that you didn't have competition in the steel industry and in this and so forth, and therefore, and equally for the governments to not be able to bid for investment. The Irish tax case, which was quite convoluted, was a perfect instance of that. And I should say the woman who handled that case, Helena Malikova, was a fellow here at Berkeley for a year after recovering from her battles with Apple over that. But the point simply is that now that having put that in place, and Europe really never created fully a single market. To the extent it did, in many ways, the big beneficiaries were the big companies from Europe, from the United States, and from elsewhere in Asia. But now that they face a new set of challenges from China, the question really became, what do we do? Now, the Single Market Act limits the ability of the national states to act. And can Europe as a whole act? That's not so clear. Two quick comments on that. The first is that the Europeans start talking about technology sovereignty, as if they, any more than we, are going to be able to create a unified ecosystem in the semiconductor industry or the like. But we shouldn't dismiss the Europeans. Remember, they have a dominant position in aircraft. They have a strong position in pharma. They have a whole range of sectors in which they do very well. So let's not dismiss that too quickly. But the calls for technological sovereignty ultimately lead nowhere, other than to raise the question of how do we, the United States and Asia, work together to have a kind of unified technological industrial ecosystem that we can all live with. The second point that one would want to make is that the major efforts that the Europeans have made have been really in regulatory policy, where what they've attempted to do is believe very strongly in something they call the Brussels effect, that if we take the lead in regulating platforms or privacy, that others will be obliged to follow. We can set aside the question of whether or not those regulatory policies in fact, led to a real Brussels effect, to some extent maybe. What's less clear to me is whether they actually created any economic or industrial advantage for European companies, who in fact don't necessarily do so well. And the fantasy, and I followed this fairly closely on the AI side of this, the AI the DMA, Digital Market Act, the Digital Services Act, are not crazy. They're pretty good. The AI policy that's emerging is ambiguous, not very clear, unenforceable, and a whole range of other things, but exactly but in any case, I think the conclusion here is Europe now faces a problem the US will face globally, which is how does it avoid reigniting competition amongst the nation states that compose Europe over who creates advantage in this new era. And in fact, with industrial policy, that becomes the critical question. How do we, not create a war of industrial policies? So we're facing the same problem that the Europeans are. We need an ecosystem, not pure technological sovereignty, and we need a bargain about what constitutes an ecosystem in these sectors that we can live with, because we clearly can't do it all alone. So let me stop there.
Awesome. Turning to Japan, I won't go into detail about the debate about to what extent the Japanese industrial policy was responsible for Japan's economic success, although I might touch on that a bit. I'll just say that Japan is often referred to as a relatively successful case of industrial policy. I wanted to make a few comments about the distinctive features of Japan's industrial policy, and then talk about the lessons that that might hold for the United States, many of which are about how Japan differs from the United States in two ways, right? One is a different country, different political, economic institutions, and also the core of Japanese industrial policy was really a post-war era. So I also want to talk about, the change over time, right? And I will try to do all that succinctly. So Japan's post-war industrial policy was successful in that the government set very clear policy goals. It deployed a coherent strategy. It employed a relatively autonomous and capable bureaucracy to implement that policy. It was really led by the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, in partnership with the Ministry of Finance, the MOF. And these agencies had kind of a cohesive ethos, which combined allegiance to the ministry with some commitment to a national mission of catching up with the West as quickly as possible. I won't go into the political strategy. I will just say that it echoes a lot of what John was saying about France, and that combination of kind of putting your pedal on the gas, but also compensating the would-be losers. And that's one of the reasons that they pulled this off politically. But these ministries had very clearly defined jurisdictions, to the point where officials could specify exactly which sectors, industry associations, and even products fell within their jurisdiction versus somebody else's. And this structure allowed them to achieve what Peter Evans has called embedded autonomy. That is, they weren't beholden to industry, and yet they had strong collaborative relationships with the industry associations and the individual firms. And obviously this model contrasts to the kind of ideal model of American regulatory state in which agencies preserve a sort of an arm's length relationship to the industries that they oversee and strictly separate the policies of regulation from broader goals. So kind of to sum up on the, the impact side, I would just say that the government at a minimum achieved two key goals of industrial catch-up very well. One, it increased the overall level of savings and investment. And two, it allocated these investments toward relatively productive, not uniformly, but relatively productive uses, right? And so this is kind of where I part company with the argument that, industrial policy is just picking winners, because actually some failures are kind of a feature, not a bug, of a successful industrial policy, right? In other words, that there was a broad direction, right, to go from, for instance, lower value added to to higher value added sectors, but obviously the Japanese authorities did not get it right every time. So how does all of this apply to the U.S. case? I think it offers some basic principles that can be applied, but need to be kind of readjusted both for a different country at a different time. The critical foundations of Japan's post-war industrial policy really included national consensus on goals, stable political regime, consensual policy process, lead agencies with considerable autonomy and esprit de corps, highly trained civil servants with a powerful sense of mission, and a dense network of relationships between government and industry. Okay, so obviously, the current day United States, to understate the point, does not have the full set. But I do think that the United States government, on a happier note, is capable of some movement in that direction. And also that, we're capable of maybe a different kind of industrial policy. And I'll just make three kind of adjustments that if you were like applying the Japanese model to the US case, things you would need to do. One, public missions, not hidden policies, right? In other words, that the US has actually had industrial policy all of these many years that it has said it doesn't. But it has been a relatively hidden one, and obviously one that's been more focused on military industry than commercial. But I think a positive industrial policy for the United States would, unlike the Japanese model of kind of this aloof bureaucracy, would have to be one with that's accompanied by deliberate communication strategies, by kind of a more consensualist and open policy process. So I guess that leads me to my second point, which would be political inclusion, not insulation. Now that may seem to ask a lot of current day American politics, and I think Paul will probably emphasize that point. But I think some progress is within the realm of the possible, and we're actually seeing at least some small steps in that direction under the current administration. And if any policy, I mean, if we take just for instance the Infrastructure Act, but industrial policy can make for some strange political bedfellows in the United States, and there is support, not uniform support, but there's certainly support on both sides of the aisle. The final thing I would say in terms of adapting industrial policy to the US reality is that it would have to be a model of central coordination with decentralized rather than centralized networks, right? Fred Block, another person who has been studying industrial policy since way before it became a thing, talks about kind of the distinctive features of the American developmental network state and how different it is kind of from the Japanese model. And according to him, it combines the following elements: targeted resourcing, so funding for specific technological challenges, opening windows, fostering multiple settings for innovation, brokering, connecting laboratories and businesses, and facilitation, building infrastructure and setting standards. So the general point I'm making is that unlike the Japanese case, where you can imagine like a top-down centralized industrial strategy, a more network version of that model is more appropriate to the United States. And finally, I want to just briefly touch on, well, also Japan was the heyday of Japanese industrial policy was from World War II, 1945, to roughly 1980. Certainly things were going downhill by 1990. And so, but what about our current era? I mean, again, even if you had the institutions, would you want to implement a kind of a post-war Japanese industrial policy? The answer would be no. Lots of differences, but one I just would like to highlight, again, building on the work of my colleagues, is that we are now in the digital era, right? And therefore, market governance, like market regulation, for example, something that you might not have thought of as being like the core of the industrial policy, like policy menu, I think is much more important in the digital era than it was, in the early post-war. And to be specific, I'm particularly thinking about antitrust and intellectual property rights, right? Also probably labor and financial regulation as well. You know, to kind of summarize in maybe an overly simple way, I think that the direction we need to go is towards tougher antitrust enforcement and lighter IP protection. In the sense that in the digital age, we need more competition. I'm not saying break up everybody, but that in terms of innovation, you're going to get more innovation in the high-tech sector if you still have some kind of level of vibrant competition. And then also in the digital era, the costs of IP protection have increased while the benefits have diminished. Yes, the United States has actually deployed industrial policy successfully in the past, and it can do so in the future. Not easy, but to meet the challenges of the moment, I think it's going to have to both reform the institutions of industrial policy to limit political capture and to facilitate implementation, and also to incorporate an even wider range of policy tools.
All right, this panel is doing such a good job at staying under time. I really appreciate that as the moderator. So Paul, we'll go over to you.
All right, we'll see if I can stay with that as well. I wanted to just start by saying how happy we are at Bessie to be sponsoring this event. It's exactly the kind of thing that we want to be doing with this new institute. And I want to thank all the guests for coming, and I want to thank Steve for organizing it, and also Amanda Boehm, who's our new associate director at Bessie, who did pulled a lot of the strings together to make this happen. I'm gonna follow Steve's lead here. I'm not going to actually say very much about the history of American industrial policy, given how little time I have. Actually, Jacob and I wrote a book in 2016, badly timed for Trump's election, called American Amnesia: How the U.S. Forgot what made the country prosper, and in which we talk a lot about the idea that the U.S. actually was built, economic prosperity was built on a mixed economy, right? Not a market economy, but a mixed economy. I always like Charles Lindblom's metaphor for thinking about that the market has these nimble fingers, right? Quite adaptable, but actually fingers alone don't get you everything that you need. You actually need a strong thumb too, which government through the exercise of authority can bring, which helps you to solve all kinds of coordination problems, externalities, and so on, that the nimble fingers of the market alone are not going to be able to achieve. And so this idea that you want that combination, getting that combination right in a way that arguably the U.S. did without a lot of fanfare in the middle part of the 20th century, right? Often in kind of hidden ways, as Steve was saying, often through national security, or you think about great public universities like Berkeley, absolutely critical for economic development. Lots of other examples as well. But when you think about the contemporary environment, and here I want to follow Steve's lead in thinking about the political moment that we're in. And so here I'm following, I don't know if it's okay on a panel on industrial policy to talk about comparative advantage, but my comparative advantage is to think about the politics rather than about industrial policy. And in that context, some of the things that you might think you want with industrial policy are substantial administrative capacity. Even though it's the thumb of government, you want some nimbleness, right? You want some capacity to learn and to be able to adjust as you do learn and as things play out. You want some predictability so that other actors in the network can have some idea of expectations. And you need some legitimacy, right? You need relatively high levels, or arguably, it's extremely helpful to have relatively high levels of public trust in order to engage in these kinds of ambitious initiatives. Now, of course, at this moment, we're probably 0 for 4, right, on those things. And I was looking at a recent Roosevelt Institute forum on industrial policy, and here's a quote from Jane Flagle, who is former White House Senior Director for Industrial Emissions, and she started off by saying, "I actually think the greatest threat to the experiment we're embarking on is the sclerosis of our democracy and the distrust of our public institutions." And I think that's probably right. And so I would just highlight to begin, I'm going to say some potentially more optimistic things in a minute, but just to begin, acute gridlock and polarization. And gridlock, not just so the Senate, the filibuster in the Senate, but also I would say particularly on the Republican side, no interest in bipartisanship for the most part around these kinds of initiatives. There has been a little bit, so it'd be worth exploring where that comes from. But in general, a political strategy that's been very successful for the Republican Party over the last generation has been to say, we're just flat out going to oppose things because we don't want you to succeed, right? We actually think that we are going to benefit much more if you don't succeed. I would add to that list an extremely powerful Supreme Court that is, in a way that probably most of the people in this room recognize, though I don't think that the American people fully recognize this yet, intensely hostile to the administrative state, right? Has the administrative state in its sights, right? So that's an important part of the political background. And then finally, very, very low levels of public trust. Right? There is not a reservoir in the way that there was in the mid part of the 20th century that one can draw on of public support, confidence in the ability of government to actually make people's lives better. Okay, so that's the reality. All right, here are two potential factors I want to start off with that I think might be places where you could think there's a little room for optimism and thinking about how this might work. And then I'm going to mention a wild card in closing. All right, so the two potential sources of optimism, one that I know more about, though I don't think it's been getting that much attention, one that I know very little about that has been getting more attention. All right, so the first is that we're actually living in a moment, at least when you have the Democratic Party with a trifecta, even a pretty narrow trifecta, in an unusual moment where it is possible to generate a lot of revenue to do things, right? So Joe Biden, famous promise, which he kept, right, during the campaign was, we're going to do a bunch of ambitious things, right? Except for the emergency stimulus stuff, it's all going to be funded. And we are not going to raise taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year, right? This is the tiny silver lining to the intense inequality that has developed in the U.S. over the last generation. That you can potentially raise, when they started, $4 trillion over 10 years, whittle down, still spend a lot of money. But there's still lots of potential there. And you can see the kind of political opportunities that created. If you think about something like the Inflation Reduction Act compared with the failed cap and trade initiative on climate in 2009, 2010, right? You're just in a much better, in terms of compensating losers, right? In terms of making people see government doing good things. If you can do something like this where you're only raising taxes on people making over 400 grand, not that that's an easy thing to do, but you had a lot of, you had basically 49 Democrats in the Senate who were willing to do a lot of that, right? So that gives you some room to run that you otherwise wouldn't have. The second one, this is the one I know less about, is the international climate. And here, I think China is an important motivator for industrial policy, and especially if one is trying to find some kind of capacity to make that bipartisan, right? So in that sense, I think they're not my area of expertise. Maybe this is the second panel today, but here's a place where you could imagine some grounds for bipartisanship. Okay, finally, the wild card. Okay, if we don't have those conditions that we might want to have of capacity, nimbleness, predictability, and legitimacy, is it possible that we can build them through policy? Right? This is something I know that Roosevelt is super interested in. Todd and I were talking about it at lunch. Can you introduce policies that actually build power, right? That build those kinds of things that you need over time, build political support, right? And therefore make it more possible. This is real. I think this is, it's an absolutely central question for thinking about the politics of industrial policy. Can we, if we build it, will they come, kind of thing, all right? And let me just say three quick things about that, right? One is, I think the early returns are at best unclear. I actually think that's the most optimistic thing that you can say about it, right? Even with a lot of money being spent, right, it's not clear how much it's changing. It's changing the political environment. We're going to get a little bit of a test run on it next year, but I would say too early to tell, but certainly too early to be optimistic about it. The second thing I would say about it is that I think if these kind of power building effects work, they are in the current climate, they're more likely to work by energizing powerful interests on your side than they are by directly changing the minds of voters, right? I think traditionally work in the social sciences have been done on what's called policy feedback, this idea that you can create these kind of self-reinforcing paths, it has really emphasized the idea that you gain support among voters, and then that makes it impossible. Like as FDR famously said, nobody can get rid of my damn Social Security program. No damn politician can ever get rid of my Social Security program, right? I don't think there's much evidence in the contemporary climate that you're going to change a lot of voters' minds. And actually, you know, at this point, mostly driven by inflation, I think overwhelmingly driven by what's going on in inflation, which I don't think actually has much at all to do with domestic policy in the US, but it's been hugely consequential. Non-college educated voters by 2 to 1 think that Trump did a better job in running the economy than Biden did, right? So that's, you know, that's an important thing to be looking at here. Okay, so I think the focus on building powerful interests, right? So clean energy, for example, right? Who are going to be supportive of your policies, build vested interests, and at the same time, you try to whittle down the vested interests that are opposed to what you're doing. I think that actually is the more reliable potential road to power building. And I think it's hugely consequential. I actually think that we underestimate how much these powerful interests matter, and we overestimate how much voters matter. And then the last point about this wild card that I would say is that if we're interested in sort of the short-term political effects that might get something like this going, it's not clear that these power building efforts have to be wildly successful to be important. They just have to be successful at the margins, right? Because we have that lovely institution of the Electoral College, we already know over a year before the election that it's going to come down to a handful of states, you know, and less than 100,000 votes potentially in a lot of those states. So if in that handful of states, you can move 20,000 to 30,000 or 40,000 votes from one column to the other, that can be hugely consequential for thinking about this. So can the initiatives that the Biden administration has launched produce that outcome? That seems possible.
Now to Kate for some further optimism.
No, this is amazing. A lot of what I was planning to say actually has ties to what all of you have said. So that is always a good thing, that I'm not completely off in another world here. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be with some of my long-term heroes on this issue. When I was at the Center for American Progress, I wrote a big paper on manufacturing and in clean energy. And John was one of my main kind of heroes I pointed to in terms of manufacturing theory. So thank you, you and Laura both, for all of your work in this space. So just a couple of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection of this conversation, industrial policy, really because it's very parallel to the energy transformation that's happening. And that's not just because that's an interesting set of industries that we can look at as a microcosm, but actually the entire economy is changing dramatically. Our industrial economy was built on fossil fuels. We are changing the theory of how the industrial economy will be built, which means this conversation about do we do that through a new industrial policy is happening at the same time that we're having a conversation about the entire shift of the economy. So I think that's important. And there's some interesting things in the way the Biden administration has approached clean energy policy as industrial policy that I think are interesting. So I did want to say, I mean, I think everyone has started with like, this isn't new. And I did want to say that there have been a subset of people, policymakers, advocates, academics in the clean energy and climate space who've been arguing for this for a long time. It wasn't the sort of front and center way we did climate policy for about 15 years, but there definitely were people, myself included, who were arguing for this for a long time, that we needed a kind of manufacturing and industry focused domestic industrial policy around clean energy to build the political power and the economic power that we need for this shift. And you can see that actually, interestingly, back before the 2008 election, the political surround was about, it's hard to remember this, but was about domestic energy production. We were freaking out that we imported so much natural gas. It's funny to think of that from other countries. And so there was a real impetus toward a domestic clean energy agenda that included, strong labor standards, that included, local economic development approaches, workforce approaches. That was part of the campaign platforms for not only Clinton and Obama, but McCain as well. So it's sort of interesting to think back on that. We have some people who've been saying that, singing from that playbook this whole time. Sherrod Brown is a great example of that. Debbie Stabenow. when she was governor of Michigan, Jennifer Granholm, who now gets to do it in the federal government. So I think that's important to look back on because it isn't new, but then we sort of went from that to, frankly, pretty much an era of neoliberal approaches to clean energy policy. Partly because we started doing a bunch of domestic production of natural gas. And so that was no longer a salient argument. And so the salient argument became climate, and that became an argument about global emission reduction and net zero approaches, which is not fundamentally about domestic industrial policy. It's really about sort of high level goal setting, the Paris Agreement, the COPs, what are we saying we're going to do at a high level, and then leaving it to everyone to figure it out underneath that. That did not lend itself all that well to domestic industrial policy around this. It lent itself to a lot of emission counting, and I would argue, solar is a good example of this. The American Rescue and Recovery Act had some really good incentives for solar, but they essentially drove us to who's got the best widget and how do we get it to scale at the lowest price for consumers, and that led to a very strong investment in China. In terms of manufacturing. So it didn't, you ended up with a lot of innovation and installation in the United States of clean energy and very little in the middle, very little manufacturing in the middle, some manufacturing with low, kind of race to the bottom manufacturing in terms of labor standards, but really not that much. So this sort of missing middle issue in clean energy. That has all changed, and I think the politics are really interesting of what has changed it. A lot of things. I was in the California government during COVID, and we did, and Laura was very involved in this whole Economic Recovery Council for the governor. And one of the things that we did research on was how each of the regions of the state was doing under COVID. And what we found was that the regions that had diversified economies with some amount of manufacturing were doing much better. And that we'd essentially seen this breakdown of supply chains, right? So supply chains break down, everyone starts freaking out about the lack of resilience of the economy. I think that's important to this conversation. And the lack of resilience overall. The Russia-Ukraine invasion, really important to focus people's attention on what happens when you're overly dependent on global energy flows to local economies. That was incredibly important. And then I would just argue that in general, increased climate events and their impact on supply chains has been more and more on the mind of CEOs and on policymakers around the world. So all these things, really lead to kind of a recognition of volatility and overdependence and, layer onto that our relationship with China, layer onto that, just concerns about OPEC. Like there's a lot of pieces of that. So all of that leads to this unusual bipartisan alliance. I think others have said this, but it's sort of interesting to look at the bipartisan infrastructure law and see this like nationalists meet pro-labor people alliance. Everybody looking at ways to build out more manufacturing and supply chains in the United States. Interesting alliance. And at the same time, this kind of bottom-up support from regions looking to be more resilient in general and more competitive, I think led to a pretty interesting bipartisan play, both for that bill and for chips and science, the semiconductor bill. So just talking a bit about implementation, first of all, under the Biden administration, actually, we do call it industrial policy, right? So modern industrial policy is something Jake Sullivan has said, Heather Boucher has said, as you know, Brian Deese said, that's really important. And I think important that marker was put down because it goes to this point that many people here have made about sort of you need that coordination and leadership from the top for this to work. So that's really important. The other thing that the Biden administration did, it was important to us at the agency level, actually selected industries, to your point, John, like actual selection of key industries. The supply chain executive order lays out key industries that the US needs to be more competitive in. That is very different from the usual, like, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let's be innovative and see where the chips fall. It's much more like, no, we have to do batteries, we have to do semiconductors. It also has been much more of a place-based approach. So one of the interesting things about both the infrastructure bill and chips and science and IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, is that they provide specific support to a couple of different types of places. And one of them is energy regions in transition from the old energy economy to a new energy economy, places that risk being left behind. You could argue that that's subsidy to the losers under what you guys have said. I actually think what's kind of brilliant about the way that it's been laid out is that it's actually positioned as an economic advantage. These are places, and frankly, some of these industries are industries with embedded infrastructure and facilities and workforce that can then be leaders. It's a competitive advantage to the US that we have these things. We have closing coal plants, they can be transformed into something else. That's in the Inflation Reduction Act, a significant amount of money for doing that transformation. We have, oil and gas industry with extreme expertise in geology and carbon management. How do we think about leveraging that? So you could argue it's subsidy to losers. I think it's also interesting in that we're sort of positioning it as an economic development approach. And then also these have all been really worker and community centered from the legislature. I think that's really, from Congress, that's really important because it's not just, again, we need these industries, let's just let them go wherever, race to the bottom, competition amongst states. It's like, no, we're setting some broad policy priorities. We're setting priorities around labor standards, around prevailing wage, around domestic production, around, support to low-income communities, support to these energy communities. I think that's really important. So let me talk for just a minute about, that's great. I mean, all the language is great. Fundamentally, all of this comes down to implementation, and just want to really underscore what everyone has said. It's both a benefit and a huge concern of mine that the administrative state being competent and, existing is really important to any of this being real, right? Because it's ultimately you have the language from Congress and then you have to figure out how to interpret it. I think important things about the interpretation. One of the things we did at Department of Energy, which I'll just point to because it's a good example of this, is that we sort of saw Department of Energy got $62 billion under the infrastructure bill. That's a significant amount of money. The Department of Energy's annual appropriation is about $45 billion. So $62 billion is a lot. Most of that for deployment, which is a really different thing for the Department of Energy. DOE has been, as any of you saw Oppenheimer, no, it's been mostly an R&D organization for a long time, switching into deployment. That means having to interpret all these things I just talked about and actually build an energy industrial policy. So you have money from Congress to do that. You've got a bunch of kind of really high level theory about how to do that. How do you actually do that when it translates down? We created at DOE, when I was there, I helped create a approach through our procurement system requiring that every company applying for funds, for grant funds under the infrastructure bill, provide a community benefits plan that actually outlined how are they going to build a workforce that's skilled? How are they going to ensure engagement with the community to shorten permitting and siting timelines? How are they going to, minimize impacts on and increase benefits to disadvantaged communities? All of that was underneath, like that's all implementation. And we made it 20% of their application. So, it's like embedding this in the procurement process in a large part to make it as bureaucratic as possible, and keep it there. We can talk a lot more about that. But I think it's an interesting approach. It's also the only way we were able to get the Justice 40 theory from the administration into implementation because it was not reflected in any of the legislation. So the only way to actually proactively provide benefits to disadvantaged communities was through implementation. We can also talk about that. I think that's a really important point. The Commerce did something similar with CHIPS and Science. They actually did some requirements around, childcare provision and labor standards in there. So number of agencies, BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, in its leasing for offshore wind, required community benefits plan approach, community benefits agreement approaches. So there's this is sort of happening. It's sort of percolating. And I think a key point of it is it's not just a sort of, I would really argue it is not the everything bagel approach that Ezra Klein, I think, thinks it is. It really is a way to ensure project viability. You're really ensuring that you're lowering litigation risk, you're increasing, you're lowering timelines for building out the projects, you're increasing the skill of the workers, you're ensuring a pipeline of workers. So all of those things are really important, but they're not reflected in the legislation. So I think that's just a key point about how this played out. A couple of things I wanted to point to as sort of challenges. I mean, I am optimistic, actually. I'm super excited about the modern industrial policy, and I'll come back to optimism at the end. But a couple of concerns or barriers besides what we've already said. I am very concerned about the attacks on the administrative state. Very, very, very concerned. I think that's a huge, I'm really glad you brought it up. This a little bit, something Steve said, the money's really siloed. So all of you talked about how important it is to have sort of a central vision, like a vision of what the economy should look like, coming from some centralized place that can at least do coordination, if not central planning. That doesn't really exist in the federal government system. There isn't really a place that does that. And the way the money flows down, and using energy as an example, every single pot of money was specific to a specific technology and a specific project. We got, for instance, at DOE, all the money to send out the door for battery manufacturing and recycling, but EPA got all the money for engagement with communities around battery manufacturing. So that's like very difficult, because it means like we're over here with the money and they're over here with engagement, and like we had to proactively find ways to work together. That's really inefficient. There's not a lot of connections. There are people who want to build industry parks where they're doing, you know, in his example, Paducah Piketon, which is one of DOE's kind of historic nuclear processing sites, is decommissioning and trying to look at its next economy. They're trying to do an industrial park where they're doing hydrogen plus carbon capture, plus they're generating energy for this other thing. Every one of those things is a different pot of money in a different part of an agency. And there's not a lot of room for coordination. It's very, very difficult to do. I really think we need to do better on that if we're going to be competitive here. Lots of the money is formula funding, and there's a little bit of an allergy in the federal agencies to directing states on how to do on any little layer of policy on how to spend that money. A lot of those programs are run by people who've been running them for 30 years and have no interest in changing how they run them. That is challenging. Longevity beyond subsidy, and I think this goes to John's earlier point just about being really strategic about what technologies you choose. You need the thing you're creating to work beyond the subsidy, because the subsidy is by definition limited. And so it isn't going to be the entire solar supply chain. It'll be a part of the solar supply chain. And you need to be thoughtful and data-driven about what part it is and what the competitive advantage is and how to do that strategically across agencies. Nobody has that job to do that right now. I think that's really important. Ultimately, there's no underlying pricing that keeps us going on these clean energy policies. So it's a theory that we're in this transition and we need to worry about climate change and these things matter, but ultimately, like a bunch of subsidy and is not going to do the job. We're ultimately going to need some kind of a change in pricing. So coming back to your cap and trade point, I don't think it's that, but I think we do need to reignite that conversation. It might be the SEC disclosure rules. We should talk about it. And then we'll talk about this on the next panel, but the interaction with allies is important. How do you maintain the delicate balance of and the bipartisan balance of trying to do these things here, but still have a relationship with your allies, but not be too protectionist, but it's challenging. Finally, this is a long game, and the US political system does not like long games, right? I mean, think about how we've dealt with climate. We've been like big announcement after big announcement, and that's a great thing. It gets you a lot of press. How to actually get there, as you've all been reading this week, like we haven't achieved any of our goals, any of them. So it's a long game. And I think I really hugely respect President Biden for doing it, for like taking on something that's going to not see any benefit for 10 years and doing it anyway. I would actually argue that's in part because he is at the end of his career that he was able to do that. But it's hard to do that. So I guess the upshot of this to me is it's hard, there's challenges, but it's absolutely necessary. I've been doing this work in climate for a long time. I do not see any way to get to the political reality of keeping these policies going and actually doing energy transformation if we don't take this approach, if we don't create real benefits to real companies in the US, across regions, blue and red, if we don't do this in a way that actually provides real opportunities to people where they can actually be part of it. I just don't see anything changing. So it's super exciting, but it's also hard.
Thank you, Kate. And again, we're staying right on schedule, which is super exciting. We have the opportunity to have questions from the audience as well as questions from on the Zoom. Stephen is here tracking any incoming there. So please, if you are in the audience on Zoom, send any questions for our panel there. But maybe to just kind of get things started off, Kate, you mentioned sort of this emerging critique that we're seeing of the U.S. industrial policy, which is that it's trying to do too many things at once. you know, this is a critique we're seeing more and more. I was wondering, for those of you that have studied sort of the international experience, are there examples or strategies that come to mind from either Asia or from Europe that give one some hope that it's possible to sort of solve multiple challenges at a time? You know, interested to hear sort of anything there. For Kate and for Paul, would just be interested in sort of examples that come to mind from the U.S. context that give you some confidence that multi-solving of these multiple problems is either, you know, is doable, necessary, or both. So we can kind of go in the order we started. If John, if anything comes to mind, or if there's anything you wanted to add, we can. There we go. Love it. Kate, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a critique you hear a lot, and interesting, you hear it a lot from the left too. I mean, it's you know, the climate advocacy community is really annoyed by all of this because they're like, it's too slow, we're in crisis, we have to do it all now. If that means we're getting everything from China, that's fine. I mean, that you do hear that. So I think there is a critique. I guess I would say a couple of, like, first, I think it is necessary because I actually, again, I think we lost some political momentum because we didn't do this before, and I think we have to do it to gain back some political momentum. But I think there's a couple of examples of doing it well. One is, the states have some good examples of this. One of the things we started to see in applications to DOE this time was like states with like very well thought out theories of how they were going to bring on clean energy manufacturing that would also create good jobs. And like, where's the workforce coming from? Where's the connection to community? And so you're starting to see a little at the state level. The states that have really good economic development agencies are good at this. California is interestingly not one of those. So I think that's an interesting thing that we've been leaders on climate policy at a very high level, but a little bit less so on this piece. And then I think you do see it. I mean, the paper that I wrote at CAP that I quoted John in was actually all about how China does this well, like set aside the central planning thing. They actually do a good job of kind of bringing all the elements together. Like, how do we do asset mapping? What are we good at? How do we build on that? How do we think about our existing workforce? How do we build in the workforce we need? How do we think about impacts? I mean, it's an interesting approach to that. So I think there's some examples, but not as many as I wish there were. Department of Defense is the other obvious example. Like, defense does this all the time. It's the example, right? And like all of it underlaid by this like national security imperative, but they are good at it at this.
I mean, I guess I would start just by saying, you know, to me, this is the advantage of political economy rather than straight economics, right? Is that recognizing that in the real world, you actually have to build sustainable coalitions if you want to get things done, if you want to make them durable. And in the American context, where a lot of this at the national level is going to happen, you know, when one side or the other has a trifecta, and so they try to do something big in a relatively short period of time, and we only have two political parties, right? So they're going to be big tents. So you know, Democratic Party is a big tent, necessarily has to be a big tent, and so, you know, doing something like they did with Build Back Better, and you know, where you have these like very broad initiatives with a lot of moving parts, because you need to hold your coalition together, and you have to at least meet some of the aspirations of the different important parts of your coalition, right? So that doesn't mean there is a real problem there, right? Like if you turn these things into like Christmas trees and you get them so overloaded that they can't, you know, you do need to think about how you balance those considerations. But I do think, I mean, I guess you know, so for the everything bagel argument, like I think that is something that's really worth thinking about, right? And thinking about whether you're weighing things down too much. But at the same time, I remember when I was first learning policy analysis, one of the things that I was taught was like, no policy only does one thing, right? Right. They policy, you know, and actually you need to be thinking about the multiple things that policies can do. And the political issue, again, is you need to think about coalition management. And you know, holding your coalition together, building your coalition, and that often is going to mean that you are going to need to convince people that they're going to be getting something from this stuff.
So to kind of extrapolate from the Japanese example is particularly difficult because, things were just so different. I do think that in the post-war era, Japan was able to, achieve multiple goals at once, both in the narrow sense of an industrial policy that was not just about one sector, but what was also about skills, for example, right? Was also about a relationship with labor. So in that sense, they were able to achieve a broad-based, and I think also as kind of we were saying earlier, they had a political strategy that worked, which involved, right, industrial policy that was favoring kind of big industries and the growth industries, but then enough political compensation for the losers that they could pull that off. Then if we switch to the United States today, we have just all of the pathologies that Paul and Kate have talked about that make things more difficult. Plus, it's not just about industrial policy. You have like multiple crises at the same time, right? You have climate change, and then you have inequality, and then you have whatever crisis of democracy, right? So again, to kind of like take just a peak of optimism out of a pretty dire story, there are ways there are synergies among those issues as well as contradictions, right? So sometimes you're going to find them contradicting each other, but sometimes you can actually, and I think that is, whether successful or not, I think that is the Biden administration strategy, right? Is we're going to have a green transition strategy that is also an employment strategy that is also a regional redistribution strategy that has both economic and political benefits. So that's what you gotta do. It's not easy, but you have to, because otherwise these policies are going to kind of like bump up against each other. So that's the goal, but it's going to be hard.
Well, most of everything's been said already. So let me just simply emphasize that this notion of how do you build coalitions is clearly crucial. In Nina Kelsey, who was a student here, is now a professor at George Washington, in the book we did called Can Green Sustain Growth, made a case that we then made in science that you really have green spirals, that you basically have to build coalitions that build on each other. That smog originally in California led people to want to control smog. And then people wanted to control nuclear. And slowly you had a pro-green basis for this. It was sort of a spiral that moved up, and one can look at it in that way. And I think Paul's point is quite right. It's both an electoral spiral and it's a spiral of concrete interests. And I think that comes back to the question of how do you subsidize. I'm perfectly happy to subsidize Chevron to put electric chargers in every gas station. One of my friends in France got fired out of the Sarkozy government for basically saying that the solution to the problem of not having enough taxis was to buy out all the taxi licenses, and just basically because people had put their investment into these medallions. That was their savings policy. And of course they were going to oppose the elimination of that. So just basically honor it as a capital asset and buy it out. And then you could go from there. So the question, I think, in the green story here, but more generally, is whose concrete interests can be bought off in a kind of way, and bought off not in a way that is going backwards. In other words, let's keep fossil fuels, but rather how do we in fact make sure that some of the people who are making money out of fossil fuels actually can make money and have a stake in this next world. And I think this notion of how do we build coalitions, both electoral coalitions and interest coalitions, is actually crucial. But when we move beyond green, and I was sort of focused on what the French don't tell us a whole lot about what to do now. I should say that on the other hand, the question of how do you diffuse new technologies really is something that the Defense Department in the U.S. did very well in starting with semiconductors. I mean, and the Japanese did very well in the NC machine tool business. But equally important becomes the question as we look forward in the U.S. To what are the transitions that are going to have to take place in the economy. And one part of it is how do you maintain advantage in the semiconductor industry? It's not just by building foundries. I mean, you know, if you build a foundry in Arizona, I saw a note in an article I saw in one of the journals I read this morning that there are 423 companies that provide support for TSMC in Taiwan. And Taiwan has basically said that it can't really produce very effectively without those 423 companies. So how do we in fact do that? What has been a great advantage, I don't know how many of you have QLED or OLED televisions, but a lot of that comes out of semiconductor development at MIT or Berkeley. And the great question is, how do you get experimentation in new approaches to semiconductors that undermine the dominant position of the major producers? Right now, basically, if you are a semiconductor producer, you know, what TSMC wants to do is going to dictate what Applied Materials that provides equipment and materials to them is going to do. And what TSMC is going to do is go follow the existing lines of development. If you want to break those lines of development, you need something like what have been proposed actually out of the Semiconductor Commons that allow shared equipment and shared assets to permit researchers in universities or in small companies to be able to make breakthroughs that would go in different directions. So I think that we need to think about that in parallel. I wasn't going to drift off into that from France into that side of the discussion, but I think it really becomes crucial thinking, what do we need to do with the new technologies? And I should say that I'm delighted that Johnson's going to give this talk, because the crucial question becomes with AI, you know, exactly to what extent is AI, can it be tasked to augment capacities and build human resources as opposed to displace them? The core to their book, one which Laura and I argue about all the time, is whether or not that's how much of a choice that is in the marketplace. But I think that becomes a crucial part of that question.
That's great.
Interrupt. I just want to, or maybe it's a question following on this discussion. So we talked about the decline in the administrative state. We talked about, just in passing, that some states in the United States have this capacity. You mentioned in passing, and it was very distressing to me to hear, that California does not. Why? Why? What's going on? So you could, and I want to relate this to the general point that in an attempt to build sustainable, fair outcomes, you can actually block action. You can block action because California is not particularly sensitive to working with big business. They're actually counter to working with big business. CEQA, counter to working with big business. So the ability of California as an administrative state to achieve outcomes that some other states seem to be able to achieve, I think is being blocked. Or my question is it because of this attempt to build sustainable fairness outcomes and everything blocks everything else?
I knew you would hear that remark. You know, it's interesting. Some people in this room have heard me say this many times. California is really interesting. You know, I had to go to the federal level to see this, but there is no economic development agency. There is a GoBiz, which is a business development agency. It's not an agency. It's part of the governor's office. There's Office of Planning Research, which I should run, which is part of the governor's office. Those are the two long-term planning arms of the California government, neither of which is an agency, which is interesting, actually, because what it does is make those very subject to, frankly, political timelines. And it gets very hard to do long-term planning when you're in that role. So I think it is interesting that California has no economic development agency and 5 environmental regulatory agencies, each of which is independent. So to your point, and so I think there's two things. There's a lack, and we also are an incredibly fortunate state. We haven't had to tell a story for a long time because the story has been so positive, right? But so we've had an interesting sort of, we lead on climate. It's mostly through regulation and big goal setting. And then we do have a real challenge with a regulatory system that allows for enormous amount of opposition to projects. Yeah. So it's, if you want to do industrial policy, you sort of need two things. You need like a vision from, you all have said this, you need a vision from your political leadership, and you need the ability to actually do it. And I think California has a hard time at both of those. I do think it's changeable. Like, we have a great story to tell, and I am very pro California. I would love to figure this out. But I think it's, yeah, I think it stymies. And so what you end up with is exactly what I said, which is this very strong innovation and installation ecosystem without a lot in the middle, with a lot of the manufacturing and supply chains going externally and then coming back. I will say, many of you, I'm sure, have seen the famous chart of California decoupling emissions from economic growth. Our economic growth goes up, our emissions go down. If you overlay that chart with income inequality gets wider at the exact same time that those two things happen, which isn't necessarily totally connected, but I would argue offshoring manufacturing is great for your emissions profile.
At the time, we have about 5 minutes left in this section, and we have not gotten to questions. What I may recommend with the organizers' agreement is that there's a few different ways we could do this. I mean, we could kind of take the break, come back, have the presentations from Laura and myself, and then have a more extended period of kind of questions from everybody. Or we can kind of have some questions now, stop, and then sort of come back for the presentations. And is there a preference?
I would say, why don't we take 5 minutes worth of questions, take a break, have presentations, and then we will have more time for questions.
Yeah, and regardless, we'll sort of wrap up sort of a period for all of us to be kind of in conversation with each other and with you towards the end after the initial presentations from Laura and myself. So turning to the audience now, any questions? Yeah, here. Sorry, no, you go. You determine.
I'll be brief, although I have my name's Priyanka Mohanty. I work at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I actually have two questions for you, Kate, and they're sort of connected, but a little bit disparate. So the first one is around this idea of IRA passing these prevailing wage standards, sort of setting, I would say, the first of its kind labor standards when it comes to these new industries that we're seeing develop. I think we're also seeing the criticism and the backlash to that, which is that a lot of these industries are going to places that have low prevailing wage or low wage standards. And so by comparison, they're able to meet those standards because the floor is so low. And so I wonder your thoughts around that, how you sort of see that manifesting, especially as we see the growth of things like the battery belt in the Southeast. So that's one. Just would love to understand your thoughts about sort of how the federal government can address that and what prevailing wage maybe looks like from a national lens, if we're thinking about those differences, and is that even possible within the federal context? So that's one. And I guess big question, would love any thoughts that you have on that. And then the second one is just back to this California back and forth that the two of you were having. Do you see a role for California to become a green manufacturer, and what steps do they actually need to take in order to do so? I think permitting was thrown around a lot. I think CEQA is really important here, but would love both of your thoughts on where California can actually build on its manufacturing history into the green economy.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. And I'm not the only person who can answer them. There's lots of expertise up here on both of them. I'm going to go backwards in order. I mean, yes, is the short answer to the California question. California is still a major manufacturer. It has lost a lot of manufacturing. It's still probably the largest manufacturing state. So, and like multiple deep water ports, huge amount of transportation systems that are aimed at global trade. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for California to be a leader. I think part of that is going to be about policymakers paying attention to the Central Valley a little bit more and the Inland Empire, and not only to the Bay Area and LA. That's really tricky politically because the entire legislature is LA essentially, with a little bit of the Bay Area. But I mean, honestly, it's a massive amount of the legislature. But and LA plays a really important role in manufacturing, in large part because of the Defense Department. But it's absolutely possible. I think we should all aim for this because it's a really exciting opportunity. We just need leadership on it and to think through some of these tricky issues. Your other question on prevailing wage, look, I really don't think it's a fundamental problem of these bills that a bunch of the money is going to right to work states. I think that is true. My former colleague and friend Heather Boucher would say that's an organizing opportunity, and I think that's right. I think it is. We need to see real benefits in those places for people so that we can move a little bit away from the like deep inequality that's in a lot of those places. So I would like to see that happen. I think it's really tricky politically to get to a national prevailing wage. I mean, I cannot see that happening. We haven't been able to raise a minimum wage nationally, right? But I do think that the kinds of things that the agencies are doing, first of all, the policy set at the top through legislation, which is great because you can point to Congress and they set the law, and then the interpretation of it to really lean in on ensuring that there really are good standards, that there really are opportunity. You know, it's not just how much you pay people and what their benefits are. It's also, is there a pathway into those jobs for people? I think is really important. Those states just honestly have done a better job on things like career tech education than a lot of other states. A lot of like very progressive states have abandoned those things and have gone in the direction of everyone needs a 4-year college degree and we're not going to do anything else. And so like, we got to catch up, right? I mean, there is a reason that the ecosystem in those states is built for being very competitive on manufacturing. And it isn't just labor. I would argue it is not just labor costs. It's more complicated than that. But others probably have thoughts on this.
John, did you want to chime in?
Two very quick remarks. One is it's very difficult, and we shouldn't try and imitate France and Japan, because the administrative state structure in both places is enormously firm and very sophisticated, both in terms of the way it operates and who heads it in terms of their technological training. The other issue that I think needs to note is that both in the case of Japan and China, there's an enormous capacity to drive and define consumer purchases in ways that, particularly in the auto industry, certainly in the case of Japan, where you had to turn in your car every couple of years, and then they could ship them off as used cars to India, which meant that there was a continuing domestic market. And in the case of China over electric vehicles, both of which are creating major sources of demand that's driving the green sector, because electric vehicles are going to drive the green sector. And if we don't solve that problem here, in the European case, the German auto industry simply walked past it. Toyota walked past it as well. The Germans even very recently were quite skeptical about whether you needed to bother, but let's set that aside. I had a friend from Intel tell me he'd met with the CEO of, let's leave the company's name, who had simply dismissed the idea that electric vehicles would ever matter. And he said, okay, so much for your company, but there we are. But I thought we needed to get those on the table.
Great. All right. So we're going to stick to the break. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to come back. Laura and I will give some remarks, and then we'll open it up for sort of an extended conversation with all of you. So thanks again for your patience. And do we have something out here to water? So we have some water. Treat yourself to some water.
Welcome back. So this session, we have only 2 presentations. So I'm giving our esteemed speakers a little bit more wiggle room. And we'll also have more time for discussion. We kind of danced around the topic of how an American industrial policy might or might not mesh with the international order. But we are going to confront that question more directly now and think about to what extent can we strengthen and leverage our partnerships for our industrial policy, or to what extent is our industrial policy going to undermine our relationship with our trade partners and allies. So on that general note, I'm going to pass the mic to Laura first, and then we'll hear from Todd.
Is it on, I assume? Okay, so how to do this. That was a great first panel. So I learned so much, and I have so many ideas floating around my head. John suggested that I might start this, I don't know why, with when I went to the Clinton administration, because John and I were working on industrial policy at the time. Not many people were. We were focused, as was pointed out, on US-Japan relations and US-Japan in technology. And the focus was very, very much, not so much Japan creating competitive advantage for its producers, but Japan keeping out American producers. It was about market access. It was about market access both in terms of trading with Japan, but also in terms of investing in Japan. I want to draw that because if you think about so much of modern industrial policy discussions in the United States are driven by concern about China. And China did not set up barriers to the access of US firms. There was massive foreign investment by US firms in China. There was, China is the first or second largest importer in the world. And a lot of those imports were things that were going through China for products that ultimately came to the United States, the Apple iPhone being the most dramatic example. So I just want to draw that distinction because when we think about industrial policy and think about the international implications of industrial policy, it's important to think about, well, countries pursuing industrial policy, what are their attitudes toward trade? Are they going to allow foreign producers to compete in the industrial objectives of their home country? Are they going to allow US companies to invest in those industrial objectives? China very, very, very much did. While it was building up its own national competitors, it was running a kind of open economy system. In fact, it was embracing aggressively globalization with industrial policy, not industrial policy at the expense of globalization, but globalization with industrial policy. And the reason I think that's important is because now, with the resurgence of industrial policy in the United States and Europe, there is a kind of zero-sum approach to this, okay? We want the production here. We want the employment here. We want the technology here. We don't want to import it. We don't want foreign investment. We want American-owned companies doing this. So it is industrial policy with anti-globalization. And that does have implications for our relations with our trading partners, our allies, our allied trading partners, Europe, and with our non-allied trading partners, China. And China remains our single largest trading partner. And think about the implications of industrial policy in the United States for the global system. The US is the largest importer and the second largest exporter in the global economy. China is the largest exporter and the second largest importer. So if we play around with this trade too much, we're fundamentally risking the global order that we created. So some will say that's not a risk at all, but I just want to bring that up. I want to start with that. I want to then get to the next point, which is I fundamentally believe that the major driver of the re-embrace or the embrace of modern industrial policy in the United States is China. That is the driver. If you think about the bipartisan consensus that has developed around this, there are very, very few issues in which there is any bipartisan consensus in the United States, but one is an anti-China consensus. China as the geopolitical enemy, China as the geoeconomic enemy, China as somebody that needs to be contained. They say we don't say that. We do say that. We basically say, we want to keep you several years behind us in terms of every leading technology. That's our goal. Our goal is literally to keep you behind. And we will do whatever we can. That is a major part of our industrial policy. And the motivator for the industrial policy is our concern about our rivalry with our rivalry with China. So I really want to point that out. I want to say that in the China area, the US says, well, we're not going to decouple, we're going to de-risk, and we're going to diversify. Yeah, but we're also going to contain. We are also going to contain. And China, I believe it will not put up with this. I believe that we will accelerate China's development in exactly those areas we are trying to contain. So now with that as kind of a broad stroke introduction, let me just say some additional things. First of all, I actually believe that the neoliberal period of globalization, that's what it's currently called, was actually a win-win strategy. It was a win for the United States. It was a win for the world. We had convergence between developed and developing countries. We had the greatest elimination in poverty in the history of the world in a couple of decades. We had the great moderation, a slowdown in the rate of inflation caused by the fact that a lot of emerging market economies were bringing product into the global economy, which reduced the rate of inflation. So there were a lot of good things about neoliberal globalization. It did occur with a reduction in income inequality among nations, but an increase in income inequality within nations. And Kate mentioned that this all started to happen at the same time. So the takeoff of globalization, say from about the mid-1990s to essentially the slowdown around 2018, that whole period of time was a period of increasing income inequality in the United States. There's no doubt about it. Increasing wealth inequality as well as income inequality. That happened to all of the advanced industrial countries. So they were subject to the same globalization trends as the United States. They were also subject to the same technology trends as the United States. And here I'm going to put something out there. Maybe it's for the next Bessie event. I believe the evidence overwhelmingly points to the fact that the major driver of income and wealth inequality was not globalization. It was not trade. It was not the China shock. It was technology. It was routine biased technological change that took out middle-scale, middle-income jobs, that wiped out much of the manufacturing employment, not production, employment in the United States and the advanced industrial countries. And now we have a new round of technological change, the AI-driven round of technological change. And I think we have to think very seriously about the income and wealth inequality effects of that. But in order to think seriously about that, we first have to admit that the last 3 decades of income inequality was not because we outsourced jobs in the United States to a lower cost location. It just isn't the case. We kept most of the production here. Manufacturing employment in the United States declined, but the cliff was employment, okay? How could that happen? Because we actually robotized and automated the manufacturing facilities. And so I think California could easily remain a manufacturing powerhouse in the United States without many manufacturing jobs. What are the implications of that for income and wealth inequality? Is, I think, a question. Okay, so now with that, let me sort of talk a little bit about the US approaches to industrial policy and the implications for our relations with our allies. John and I have thought a lot about this. And in order to do that, I want to start with what I consider to be 2 really good speeches to understand US industrial policy right now, and the fact that there are differing views within the administration on this. One is Janet Yellen's view, and one is Jake Sullivan's view. So Janet Yellen made a very effective speech a few weeks before Jake Sullivan's speech last spring. And she said, look, industrial policy is important in the United States. Think of it as an investment policy. Think about it as investing in the foundations of economic growth. Now, some of those are general. We need to invest more in human capital, but we need to invest more in infrastructure. And we need to invest more in energy because there's an energy transition going on. And Janet herself has been deeply involved in climate change before she went into government. I think she would say the fundamental way to get this done would be to figure out a way to price carbon, but she understands that's not possible. So yeah, we're going to need industrial policy as an investment strategy to deal with the energy transition and to deal with climate change in general. So that is her investment interpretation of industrial policy. Some of it's general, some of it's like invest more in education, invest more in highways, but some of it is sector specific. Where she gets to sector specific in speech besides green is semiconductors. And she basically says, look, there is a national security rationale for some US industrial policy, and it is the rationale in semiconductors. She's not really talking about supply chain interruptions, because it turns out that those supply chain interruptions have largely disappeared. They existed during COVID. Actually, right now, the US is sort of on the brink of maybe in the period of overproduction of semiconductors. They're all over the place. So I think she would say, you know, if that was the reason for industrial policy in semiconductors, I don't necessarily buy it. But if you want to do national security concerns with China, okay. Jake Sullivan's speech is all about China. And first of all, he basically says the US economy is a mess because of China. He literally says that we basically have been hollowed out. They took our industries away. They did unfair trading practices. And that plus national security, we have to really contain them, okay? They have very different views of the US economy, underlying views. Janet Yellen's view is a positive, it's a strong economy, needs more investment. Jake's is a weak economy, we need to rebuild, and we need to rebuild because of the China shock of China. So I just want to point out that that difference is important, because going forward, the consensus around what to do with industrial policy will very much, I think, reflect your views about the US economy. And Jake Sullivan's views right now are more prevailing than Janet Yellen's views. So let me go with that. Let me talk a little bit in my concluding remarks about the need for coordination and collaboration. Even if you accept the notion that the industrial West needs to make, the industrial democratic West needs to make sure it is not heavily dependent on a rival, China, for national security goods like semiconductors, but also for things like batteries. If you just say we don't want to be as dependent on China, these are global industries. And an efficient industrial policy, an effective industrial policy, one that does not result in tit-for-tat, wasteful subsidies and overproduction and benefits to companies that really shouldn't get the benefits, because the way to do that is to coordinate with your allies. We should have from the beginning been working. There are allied nations all around the world in the semiconductor industry. And the industry itself exists all around the world outside of China. And we are trying to promote production here. I will go to the last estimate of the TSMC, how much more expensive it is to build a fab in the United States. I mean, forget it. If we end up spending 5 times as much to build a fab in Arizona with a US company that is behind by a few years, let's say that would be the good news, just a few years behind. Does that make any sense? Is that what is an effective industrial policy? I put that out there because, for example, Samsung, Korea is an ally. Samsung's number 2 to TSMC. Work with Samsung. I don't. So I guess I want to pose a challenge for US industrial policy is in global industries, whether it is a green industry like batteries or critical materials, or a national security industry like semiconductors, to get the most effective, efficient industrial policy, you certainly should not be preferring US companies over foreign companies. If you want to say the production has to be in the United States, just make sure that the provisions of the laws say that production in the United States by a foreign company will be treated equally with production by a US company in the United States. What does ownership matter? If location matters for the jobs or the production, then ownership shouldn't matter. So I think we have so far missed the ball on coordination. the pushback by the Europeans in things like our IRA have led us to begin to make adjustments, because basically they said, are you kidding me? You guys are doing all this Buy America by preference stuff. And what you'll do here is we'll have our own green policy, we'll have a subsidy war, we'll have a conflict, trade conflict. All this is unnecessary if we coordinate. So I do think that becomes a very important part of this discussion, and it hasn't been, and that's what I've been asked to add to the discussion. Let me just end on AI, because I think of the green challenge. Let's go to the green challenge and a shared global challenge of climate change. So a shared global challenge should be dealt with by sharing policies and sharing responsibilities and working together. Sadly, in the area of green, the two biggest polluters and the two biggest actors here at this point are the US and China. And for all the reasons I started with, it's going to get really harder and harder to cooperate with China. The second one is AI, because all of nations of the world share the same risks from AI, and they are dramatic. The risk that AI will disrupt labor markets, the risk that AI will eliminate good jobs and increase income inequality, the risk that AI can be weaponized to build chemical and nuclear weapons, the risk that AI will drive an increase already happening in the volume and spread of misinformation that undermines trust in governance and government. The risk that AI could further increase the market power of a handful of companies. I hope you've all been following this totally scary, scary SpaceX stuff on the Ukraine war. Okay, that company is a nation state now. It's a nation state in terms of dealing with war. Do we want, so these risks are huge. And so again, these are shared risks. Nations share these risks vis-a-vis AI. And ideally what you would like is a new set of multilateral rules, a governance structure to enforce those rules, to handle these risks. And again, who's the competition with in AI? It's the US and China. It's the US and China. And, you know, if you read somebody like the Kissinger book with Eric Schmidt, it's all about how we have to contain China in AI, not cooperate to regulate. No, nothing like that. We got to win. We got to beat them in AI. And my notion is these are two global shared challenges, AI risks and climate change risks. And this is where multilateral cooperation can really work. And maybe we can start with multilateral cooperation with our allies. Which we have argued. So let me end there.
Fantastic. Mike is yours.
Great. Thanks so much. And again, thanks to Amanda and Steve and the whole team for organizing this great set of panels. It's been a real delight to participate in them. I want to do a few things and then try to leave as much time as possible for conversation with all of you. I want to first start off by just very quickly, I think, highlighting some of the central sort of problems that what I'm going to call Bidenomics, which could also be industrial strategy, industrial policy. We'll get into that a little bit, what those distinctions are. The central problem that it's trying to solve, then get into how it's trying to solve it, and then you sort of end with some reflections on what that problem and solution set leads to, and by way of thinking about what modes of international cooperation could be particularly useful. I think the central international policy challenge that the U.S. is trying to confront with this administration is not the need to sort of provide market access or low tariffs for the rest of the world, because that's something we've already kind of largely accomplished in past decades. The key thing and the key uncertainty of planetary importance that the U.S. was trying to solve is its utter lack of international credibility on climate policy. So the challenge then becomes, and the reason obviously for that challenge is that you have one of the two major political parties comprising largely of fossil fuel interest and climate deniers. Yet that party with some regularity wins elections and gets to represent the US on the international stage. So what strategy could you have domestically that could lead to more stickiness in the US commitment to climate, despite that sort of like complete lack of political reliability? And the answer that I think you pretty quickly come up with, especially looking at the international experience, is that things like carbon pricing are pretty easy to reverse. We've seen the places where they've been imposed and then reversed. In the US context, you would have to assume almost as a matter of policy design that the Supreme Court would overrule it. So you would be looking at best a pretty Pyrrhic victory were you to be able to implement it and get it past the US Senate, and that never happened. We know that because of the Waxman-Markey experience. So if sort of almost by process of elimination, you do end up sort of getting pretty quickly to an industrial policy like approach for some of the reasons that our panel has talked about, which is that it's a lot harder to argue, just much of the same way that it was harder in decades past to argue against the military industrial complex when there was defense dollars and defense jobs going into every single congressional district in this country. There's a theory that there's a climate version of that that can lead to even people like Marjorie Taylor Greene to at least not roll back sort of the industrial investments that are being made. And I think that we've had, that's the theory, right? Could be right, could be wrong. The theory is that there's going to be more political stickiness if you build in that sort of jobs and dollars angle. We've had two tests of that, and it's coming out looking pretty good. The first was the midterm elections, which was one of the best performances by an incumbent party in US history. And then the second was the debt ceiling negotiations, where Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans suggested that the number one priority was to roll back the Inflation Reduction Act. They weren't able to do that. They did not have the votes within their own caucus for it. And then partially that's because of some of these battery facilities and others going into districts around the country. So, it's not over yet. But so far, that plus the fact that the Supreme Court has never overturned a spending package at the federal level in US history just gives some reason to think that sort of in the one window that they had, they actually pushed a strategy that kind of had both some legal and institutional logic to it. I think the other sort of key context here in the US context, and we can sort of go, I think there's a lot of different research and different perspectives on sort of the net job impact of things like NAFTA or the China shock. But I think, what's pretty indisputable is that there wasn't a heck of a lot of economic planning that was going into managing those transitions. And that did lead to some pretty profound changes in the politics and political geography of our country. David Otter and other folks have looked at the impact not only on jobs, but also of political polarization and sort of the growing attraction of extremist right-wing politics, and it tends to go up in some of the places that have been harder hit by some of those dislocations. These are complex processes; they're not monocausal by any means, but that was the sort of immediate lived history of the Democratic Party. We just did several decades of a lack of planning, and that seemed to carry with it some political, if not pretty serious economic problems that they wanted to kind of correct for. And so, I think that, so what do we have? This produces over the course of a few years something that the administration starts calling Bidenomics. If you go back to the election campaign, there was primarily 4 interrelated crises that the administration wanted to address: COVID-19, an economy that had been shut down, the climate crisis, and inequality. If you sort of fast forward a little bit to, sort of after the midterm elections, that kind of ends up getting distilled into what they're calling Bidenomics, which is essentially 3 different planks. One is the public investment and industrial strategy plank that has been the focus of our conversation today. That's complemented by worker empowerment and anti-monopoly policy. And the three of those kind of go together and reinforce each other, I think, in important ways. And rewinding a bit to sort of an April 22 speech by National Economic Council Director Brian Deese, he sort of identified, he made a case for the importance of public investment, both to correct market failures, but also to fill in missing markets and create backbone for economic activity. But sort of identified four key challenges, which I think are super relevant to both of these panels today. One is sort of balancing the need for resilience and the need for price stability. One is balancing national strategy and international engagement, balancing speed and fairness in building, which is something that we've talked about a lot today here. And then the idea that these balances are not just incidental to the task at hand, but are actually overlapping and reinforcing in both sort of positive and negative directions. And so, I think taken together, like on the one hand, you could sort of you could say Bidenomics is a theory of economic growth, and sort of that's meant to replace Reaganomics. So instead of getting the government out of the way, we're sort of putting the government in the way in a way to help guide economic activity, and that sort of paying attention to income inequality and concentration are going to be key to how well and sustainably your economy grows. So it's a theory of economic growth, but it's also a theory of power. Right? Which is that you don't tackle some of those complex balances like Brian Deese outlined. It would be difficult enough in a world of 30% union density, high levels of trust in government, right? And government agencies that had so much staff, they had staff to spare, right? Like all of that would be, it would be hard enough even in that universe. But I think in the world that we have, it's challenging indeed. And so I think that leads to, rightly a lot of focus on, it's still early days. We don't know a lot on sort of where a lot of these public investments are going to go. Some of them are going to take years to materialize. But we do know that, with every announcement of public investment dollars, it's an organizing opportunity. I mean, I think as you were saying, I mean, there's a reason for community groups, labor groups on the ground to start seeing that the publicness of that investment, the publicness of that dollar, giving them leverage that they might not have otherwise had to try to address some of the longstanding structural inequities in the country. But I think that so far we're seeing some examples of really great success stories. I mean, there was a great New York Times story by Stephen Greenhouse not too long ago about Bluebird in Georgia, an electric bus company that received federal dollars under the infrastructure bill, and then unions, the steel workers, sort of put together a whole campaign to organize that facility in a right to work state, and win an actual election. And I think that's the kind of thing that can inspire copycat campaigns elsewhere. I think we've seen some not so great instances, like some of the reporting around TSMC in Arizona, just not really getting on board with the kind of more holistic Bidenomics approach in a variety of different ways. And then there's more ambiguous cases. Kate mentioned sort of some of the announcements, Kate and Paul, like the last few weeks even around things like Ørsted, the Danish offshore wind manufacturer, that one of the consequences of trying to run so much of this really national security important investments at an arm's length through the private sector is that it means just in the same way the public sector can make dumb decisions, the private sector can also make dumb decisions. And in this case, the public is sort of a little bit in, that we're sort of at the mercy in a sense of some of the smart or dumb decisions. And apparently in this case, there was, not an inflation rider that the company insisted on as a part of their investment. So now sort of the public sector is on the hook. I think that what that suggests is that there is a lot of industrial policy tools that we have from both sort of the international and historic experience that were not a part of the IRA, but that maybe should have been, and that maybe could be in sort of future generations of policy, God willing that there's unified government or at least a supportive Republican, collaborator there. But I mean, I think that some of it we can really sort of see from U.S. history is that it'd be great at this moment in time to have something like a Reconstruction Finance Corporation or a National Investment Authority that could step in with zero interest or low interest loans at this precise moment, like when Ørsted instead needs money. But then also, attach some conditions to that to make sure that we get sort of better performance in the future. I think there's a range of other sort of institutions that we could consider. But let me shift over to sort of what does this set of tools, what does it imply in terms of a theory of international collaboration? And I think that it's not, Bidenomics, it's not sort of starting, we do have examples in history of thoughtful models of international collaboration that could easily accommodate the sort of multi-solving, dynamic sort of all of country economic development strategies. Things like I'm at the Roosevelt Institute. I'm obligated to have a Roosevelt reference at least once a talk. So looking at the vision in FDR's Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter, looking at the proposals from the Roosevelt and Truman administrations around the International Trade Organization, the ITO, which combined not only trade goals but also competition, labor empowerment, commodity stability policy as a part of it. It didn't end up passing, but there, between that, the new international economic order and other proposals, there are models for stronger international collaboration. The status, the sort of stock of international institutions that the Biden administration inherited don't lend themselves super obviously to accommodating some of what the administration is trying to do. We have a GATT and WTO order that really creates a presumption against discrimination of any kind, that really has a focus on lowering unit cost, that is pretty explicitly on a per se basis penalizing of industrial policy. And that really is about sort of leaving as much discretion to market actors as possible. But clearly, what this moment requires is very clear, bright line discrimination between clean and dirty production. That needs to become a sort of a foundational principle of the international order. We need sort of multi-solving industrial policy that facilitates structural transformation, that isn't solely about sort of minimizing cost and wages in the first instance, but also uses the power of the state to help navigate and cushion supply shocks, and clearly that pays attention to democratic legitimacy. I think we see, in some of the Brian Deese, Jake Sullivan, and others, we see sort of the emergence of something that could be called a Biden doctrine, which could be the template for a new set of international rules around mutually accommodating green industrial policies. I think it starts with the presumption that we're not in a situation of glut in the international markets on clean energy. We're actually in the opposite problem, which is we need to bring many trillions of dollars of investment a year into clean energy. We need to create massive amounts of markets that don't yet exist for a lot of these products, and that we're far from the situation where our success in a sector is coming at the expense of Europe, provided that all of us are willing to step up and spend the money that's needed. I think one promising model for what a kind of new era of international cooperation could look like is in the negotiations between the US and EU around the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum. It's not an accident that those sectors were chosen. These are set to be the highest carbon emitting sectors within the next decade or so. They're highly trade sensitive, and they're already, as John and others were saying, there's a long history of intervention in the sector. That means we're not starting from sort of a free market status quo. We're starting from a heavily regulated and managed market. And so the opportunity is to move over the motivation for what those interventions are about, from a one that's purely about sort of pre-climate crisis economic concerns, to really having the opportunity for this to potentially be the world's first trade agreement that sets tariffs based on the embedded emissions in the products themselves, with a commitment to further decarbonizing their own domestic markets. And the ultimate goal here is to build markets for clean production. and create an open platform where there can be technical collaboration on standards, measurement between like-minded allies. And then if this is successful, it can provide a precedent for other sectors and for other sort of international coalitions. That's a promising model. We're not there yet. I think in part because the US, while the US, all these sort of like intellectual ideological changes have happened among the policymaking class in the United States, but that hasn't automatically followed everywhere else. And I think in particular in Europe, because the EU project does so much to take many economic policy decisions sort of out of the domain of policy making full stop, really, that you just have a sort of a lingering sort of, I would say, reflexive kind of commitment to sort of a 1990s style understanding of the GATT and WTO norms. That I think is hard to reconcile with sort of this case for a positive structural discrimination between clean and dirty production. So I think that it's a promising model. We can talk more about some of the details, but I think like what is clear, and I mean, and I think that like any reading of the Jake Sullivan speech leaves clear that there's maybe a vision there, but there is a lot of detail that needs to sort of be filled in. And I think that some of the clear, like what should be low hanging fruit is to take some of what we learned with COVID and sort of the vaccine scarcity and rethink at a fundamental level intellectual property protection for clean energy products. That's not something that's sort of top of the discussion in DC these days, but I think it's something that we're going to need to start signaling if we actually want developing countries to see themselves in some of what we're trying to do. I think I'll sort of just stop there, but I think I think that like the one thing that some of what you were sharing about concerns, Laura, about some of the possible negative implications of Bidenomics, I think deserve to be taken very seriously. I think I'm somewhat comforted by the fact that I don't read the policy specifics in the same way that you do on some of this. Which is that I think that especially I would be really concerned given sort of who are the clean energy leaders in the global economy if the US was discriminating against foreign owned businesses. I think that would be terrible. Luckily, I don't think that's what we're doing. We're not doing that. And in fact, I mean, if you look at some of the leading firms that are lined up to receive, you're looking at largely foreign firms. So I think that that's really positive. And I think that the Buy American rules, I think in most cases, I've heard the IRA described as a layer cake, right? Which is that there's basically like a 30% subsidy if you engage in sort of the clean energy production around hydrogen, around batteries, or whatever the sector is. And then it really is optional if you decide to like go up to sort of be better to unions, to use domestic supply chains. All of those things are optional. And so I think that I guess one of the things I would sort of say to this room of researchers and students is that there is a total wealth of research questions to be asked here, because almost every single investment project is going to look different. Investors some of them are going to choose the Buy America requirements, some aren't, right? And you're going to have a lot of opportunity to measure what works and what doesn't. And so, yeah, I think that I just would end with that there is a lot of good research questions here. And we're always looking forward at the Roosevelt Institute to collaborating with any of you that want to ask them, especially if you can do some free labor for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura and Todd, for two fabulous presentations. I am going to keep my promise to open things up in a moment, but I do want to draw out some of the other members of this panel first. So starting with Kate, in your presentation in the first panel, you said that when you were at the Energy Department, you had to try to achieve a kind of a delicate balance in terms of relationships with allies. So I just wanted to invite you to flesh out a little bit more your comment there. To what extent were kind of international partnerships, integral to what you were doing? And what was your strategy to kind of achieve that balance?
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I really want to underscore how important it is to recognize that so much of the progress in particularly energy sector in clean energy has been made in other countries, right, for the last few decades. So huge amount of insight from commercialization in China, from the EU on a lot of these big installation systems, particularly in wind. So I also am glad. One of the things that was a negotiation, as Laura was alluding to, and I think came out the right way, was the ability to invest in companies from other countries, because that was actually part of this. Was like, actually these companies have key insight and key research and key experience with how to do this that we don't have. So I think a lot of that was a lot of diplomacy. The Energy Agency actually has an international team, which a lot of people don't know, but they do a lot of this. They engage in a lot of this kind of energy diplomacy through things like the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is a really important international conversation where this exact kind of thing happens. People try to think through kind of who's got the expertise in which part of the supply chain and how do we bring it to bear. I think one of the interesting things that was that is the Ørsted example, sort of interesting in that many of these European companies, of course, always have unions and labor standards and provide benefits and have pathways, and then they come to the US and they're like, we no longer want to do that thing that we always do when we're in Europe. And so that was interesting, just in terms of like surprisingly bringing some of the European companies along on some of those standards was surprisingly harder than you might think. But I do think China it's super complicated, right? Like so much has been done that's been really important on shared technology approaches with China, particularly on things like carbon removal, which we could not get the US to demonstrate for years. Like we could not get any region to do it. And so we learned a lot from those projects. In China, trying to do that here, critical minerals, another great example, have not been able to do it for a lot of really valid reasons. And I think that's critical minerals to me is like the big question mark on this, honestly. It's if you believe, and just to slightly contest something from Laura referring to Janet Yellen, yes, we maybe have seen the end of supply chain shocks from COVID, but I am telling you that supply chain shocks from climate impacts are going to become more and more common because of climate events, because of so much of the supply chain is in the global south, and climate events are becoming a massive disruptor. So I just think that's going to keep happening and get more serious. So you have climate events disrupting places where we've done critical minerals, and it's a national security issue, right? And so that is a huge question mark. And I am not going to claim that like massive progress has been made on how to figure that out. I mean, Canada is a really interesting partner on that, but I can't claim that we've solved this.
Thank you. That's great. Okay. So moving down the line to Paul, in your first panel presentation, you talked about how U.S. politics and weakness in administrative capacity undermine our ability to develop and implement an effective industrial policy strategy. So then you added, right, that the China threat kind of somewhat moderated that. So I wanted to just ask you if you could like take that same analysis and apply it to this question of coordination and cooperation with allies. You know, on the one hand, does the China threat make that easier in a way that
Thank you for getting here.
barriers, or is international cooperation something that sort of inherently has a very fragile support base, such that it's not really sustainable?
So I know you're being nice and you're trying to bring me in here, but I think I'm going to punt because I don't feel like I'm qualified to answer that question. Because I'm a domestic policy person, but I'm going to, since I have the mic on now, I'm just going to say one quick thing about one thing that Laura said, which is about the rise of inequality. And I just can't, I feel like I need to push back just a little bit on this, because if you frame the question in the US as, is it technology or globalization? Then I'm on your side in that argument. I think it's more technology than it is globalization. But I think and this is important because if we're trying to think about what the prescription is, you have to get the diagnosis right. You have to understand what's going on in the economy that you're trying to fix. And I think more important in explaining why the US is a huge outlier in the growth of inequality, you know, and especially top 1%, top 100th of the 1%, right? Which is just not true in other rich democracies. Like their inequality has grown a little bit, right? But so for some of the reasons you talked about, like 90-50 ratios, things like that, but nothing like what you see in the US, right? Where, you know, we become an oligarchy in a lot of ways, right? That's politics.
That's policy.
That's politics and policy. Right?
Turning to John, not too surprisingly, I want to ask about supply chains. You know, and the core issue, or the most important one that gets talked about, is obviously semiconductors. And there's a lot of talk and even action in terms of kind of coordinating with our allies on the semiconductor supply chain. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, how feasible is that? You know, can that work?
I think that in responding to that, not just in semiconductors, but more generally, there are two questions that need to be addressed. The first is, what do we need from our allies? I mean, for example, rare earths. It turns out, by the way, that Vietnam has enormous assets of rare earths. The question will be who gets to develop them. And there's money to be made there for our appropriate allies and partners. And I think we need to define that. What do we actually want from whom? And the second is, what do our allies need? Because in some ways we underestimate the fact that it's a perfectly legitimate question for the Europeans to say we should not be simply dependent on American decisions about which semiconductors should be available. We want to basically produce those semiconductors here. And remember, there's two kinds of, I'm oversimplified. There's two categories or three categories of semiconductors: absolute cutting edge, which NVIDIA is making, which are now getting down around 2 nanometers, which only TSMC for the moment can actually make, and which the next round of their plants are going to be $30-40 billion a piece. I actually had the pleasure of asking Jensen Huang at a meeting I was at for a couple of days whether he thought we could break loose from Taiwan. Now, he is Taiwanese in origin, so he has a geostrategic view on what the answer to that is, but he literally had trouble grasping the question. It was not obvious to him that it was a question that could even have an answer. But the question is, what do they actually need? And therefore, what kinds of deals get made? There are two parts to that. What access to technology is needed? What access to next generation development of technologies is needed? If we have semiconductor commons, should we? This was an argument we actually, Laura and I and others had with folks in commerce and at DOD over whether or not you let the Europeans and Japanese and Koreans into those bargains. IMEC, which is a Dutch Netherlands company that does this, interestingly allows the Chinese in, which means that a lot of American companies don't want to participate. Is the condition of it, in fact, allowing them into our semiconductor commons, kicking the Chinese out of those, et cetera. So exactly on that needs to be spelled out. And some of it, as we're talking about in steel and in aluminum, they're perfectly legitimate questions over, we want to basically have some of the production here. You can't just have all of it. How do you balance those kinds of questions when it isn't in the abstract over what are the general rules, but it's in the concrete over who gets what? So that, in fact, the whole global trade negotiations are going to, in fact, take on a very different kind of form. And we could spend a whole other session on whether we can get to something. Probably recreating the WTO so it actually exists would probably be a place to start.
Fantastic. Let's open it up to the floor for questions. Amanda, you're empowered.
Hi. Excuse me. Hi. So I have a couple questions, but I'll start with one, and then maybe if we have time, I can circle back and ask another one. But my first question was, we've been talking about global supply chain resiliency, and of course that's very important. But as someone from one of those climate-stricken developing countries, Pakistan, what's seemingly more important to us is the resilience of global financial markets. Because what has hurt the most about the Ukraine war is not the supply chain disruptions of the price of wheat, but it's been that the global economy has collapsed around us, and now the companies which are supposed to be developing us, which are supposed to be bringing, services and goods, have completely pulled up out, and the stock market has collapsed, and the currency has devalued twice over in the past 2 years. And so I was wondering what, if any, thoughts the panel had about how you can ensure that financial instruments are either a less core part of your strategy to tackle global climate change, or if financial instruments will remain the means by which you ensure that this is a global project, how the random gambling of the market does not screw over the global south. Thank you.
It seems like a question for that end of the table. Either
very, very tough question. It's a recognized question. I think that there is a lot of deep thinking going on and a lot of kind of developing recommendations coming out of the International Monetary Fund, more than from the World Bank, on trying to think about whether, at the end of the day, maybe there's additional SDR creation, and that becomes a fund to help countries in their long-term climate change objectives when you have these swings in global financial markets. So I recognize you're raising an important question. People are trying to come up with solutions. There are no solutions right now. And, one of the things that was true during the neoliberal height of globalization, when you did have much of the global south, the growth rates were beginning to converge, you had a very low cost of capital global environment, and that is not going to return. I fear that those 25 years of declining global interest rates, nobody predicted those. Everybody was shocked by them. And I think there is a general view that we're in a phase now where rates are going to continue to go up, maybe not at the pace that they went down. So this is a different global financial market. And put on top of that, this long-term need for funding to address this climate change, I think we will see the development of a new fund, a new lending capacity, but it will take time. It will take time. So that's an optimism that I have, actually.
There's a parallel story to that alongside of the story that Laura is playing out and that you're asking about, which is what happens to the role of the US dollar in the global financial system. I mean, if that implodes, then in fact, a whole array of other questions come into and the use of the dollar as a weapon in the current Ukrainian and other kinds of controversies is in fact putting that at some risk, not a lot of risk, but some risk. Equally interesting is the European playing with the idea of creating a central bank digital currency for Europe, which in my view has two purposes. One purpose of that is to try and create a unified European financial system, which they haven't really been able to do, and which this can force. By the way, Brian, his judge, and I've been poking at some of this, and one of my good friends in Finland has been saying that explicitly that is part of the goal. If they do that, it's of course a question of what does a central bank digital currency look like? What's it do to other financial intermediaries? Part of it is to simply block private digital currencies, but part of it is to, in fact, rival the dollar. But there have been efforts to do that before. The euro was such an effort. It's not been exactly a triumph in that regard. But I think there is a question, and even some of our colleagues, like Barry Eichengreen, who a year ago would have said there's no chance of the dollar being displaced, would now say there are questions. So I think that has to be put alongside of that.
Hi, so far we've talked about Bidenomics sort of as one package of entities. In reality, I mean, they're two separate bills and sort of a third, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which sort of gets tacked on at the end. And both the CHIPS Act and the IRA now are about a year old. And it strikes me that sort of within this encompassing umbrella called Bidenomics, the two are actually on somewhat different trajectories. And I would just be curious for panelists' thoughts on that. So for instance, every week we hear new news about a new battery plant opening somewhere. The map of new investments is really quite impressive, and I think exceeds pretty much even the most optimistic projections that people had at the time. But the CHIPS Act is a bit of another story where there's yet to be a single dime to be dispersed. We've talked a little bit so far about the inherent challenges of building 5-nanometer semiconductor fabs, which are the most complex objects ever produced by humanity. And photovoltaic panels and electric batteries are somewhat less complicated. So I would just be curious your thoughts about sort of the different trajectories, if you sort of agree with my kind of low confidence hypothesis about that, what might account for that. And then also to just sort of underscore something that Laura said at the beginning, which I think is really important, is that actually China, it turns out, has a homegrown 7-nanometer semiconductor that surprised everyone. And so if the goal, as outlined by Jake Sullivan at Brookings in April, was for the U.S. to stay 1 to 2 generations ahead or more, that actually this package of domestic investment and sanctions means that the gap between those two is actually shrinking rather than increasing. So I think that's something that's worth noting as well. Thanks.
I'm going to say quickly before Todd says something much more intelligent, but I really think there are 4 bills. So I would really argue that Bidenomics is American Rescue Plan, infrastructure bill, CHIPS, and IRA, because American Rescue Plan, few people realize how much of a investment it made in regional economic development and planning. The Economic Development Administration 10x'd its budget under that bill. And a bunch of the regions that are now seeing battery plants and other growth are regions that did asset mapping and planning under American Rescue Plan dollars to figure out how to be competitive in that space. So I think that's really, really important. And then the infrastructure bill really creating foundational investment across, sort of to your point about Janet Yellen and investment theory across, not just highways, but the grid, EV charging, broadband. I mean, really creating kind of the system that allows for then people to have economic growth. So I think it's all 4. That's my only point. And then Todd will say the actual answer to that question.
I think we've got like a little ghost in the PA or something. Yeah. It's kind of interesting. Disagreeing with you. Maybe it's the Trump people. I don't know. I mean, so I think it's fair to sort of say that there's different pace across the different pieces of the different industrial policy bills. I think a lot of that is just due to the different modalities of like how they operate, right? I mean, part of the reason the Europeans were freaking out when they finally realized what was in the IRA was that it's fair. I mean, a lot of the tax credits are just automatic. It's like companies can just set up a spreadsheet today that sort of says, we're assuming we're getting this tax credit. This is like what our returns are going to look like over the next 10 years. This is what we can justify in terms of capital expenditure. Boom. Whereas with a lot of the European industrial investments, they have on and on a dollar to dollar level or dollar to euro level, about the same, very similar levels of subsidies. It's just that you have to go through a much more complicated process at the European level to qualify for some of them. So I think that's leading to a little bit of a race to the top where they're trying to figure out how to streamline their investment incentives to make them more automatic along the lines of what we're doing. Whereas I think that, like, you're right. I mean, these processes that require sort of, notice of funding opportunities and then sort of a detailed back and forth, like as we see with the CHIPS Department at Commerce, that takes a lot of time. But then I think the apples to apples comparison would be what is the loan program office at Department of Energy doing? Because that's what follows sort of similar process of back and forth between the agencies. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think any money post IRA has necessarily gone out the door at the loan programs office. I think they've made some investments, but it's not necessarily of the new money.
That's right. It's their biggest new pot of money is the 250 billion loan for repurposing and reuse of energy infrastructure. And it just took a long time to get the rules written for that, but it takes an average of 300 hours to do a loan program office application. It's a very intensive process because it has all these processes have a ton of anti-conflict backstop stuff built into them. They are complex. So I think you're absolutely right. IRA, there's a lot of those battery plants. It's not because the money's actually gone out or the tax credits have been awarded. It's all prospective, right? Whereas both the infrastructure bill, energy dollars for things like the hydrogen hubs and the DAC hubs and the CHIPS Act money are all part of these very, competitive processes.
Yep. So I think that we'll see more results from those programs in the years to come. But yeah, it's not like it's not months, it's not weeks and months. I mean, it probably is going to be more the case of years. So yeah, we'll stay tuned.
I think it's really interesting, the tax point and the fact that companies. So I know the Treasury has been grappling with getting the tax code adjusted because there's so many parts of the subsidies the tax credits you can get for different things. So they're like writing this now. But in the meantime, it's exactly as you say, companies are just doing the calculus. They're just assuming they're going to get the tax credits. They're permanent tax credits. They're extended forever, and they are making the investment. Whereas all the rest of the money has to be allocated. And in semiconductors, I mean, I worry that, so you look at that big chunk of money that went to commerce, but actually then you kind of look at, well, there's a big chunk of money at, I think it's NSF for talent development. It's kind of an odd place. And then there's a whole other big chunk of money at DOE. And how do you coordinate those chunks of money? I don't know. And then finally, just John's point about the ecosystem you need to support a major new fab facility, it doesn't exist. I read something which sort of suggests, if the Congress really wanted to accelerate the development of a fab in Arizona, what they would do is they would ease the visas and allow all the talent to come from TSMC. TSMC says they need it, okay, to come over and help build and run the plant. And if you don't do it that way, it's going to take a very, very, very long time before you get an operational plant. And then the other thing I will say here, because this is my economist speaking, I worry a lot about what happens to the cost of semiconductors done this way. Now, there's a possibility what you get is overproduction, and that's great because prices go down. The private companies bear a huge penalty for this. But there's also the possibility that we build a lot of high cost production capacity in the United States. And that just slows down the digitization of everything. Do we really want to have high cost fabrication in the United States when there's a global supply chain and we could rely on significant amounts of that coming imported? So I do worry about that.
Two quick comments. The first is in the semiconductor area, it's a perfect instance of where there really are allied common interests across this. Because what is the actual problem with TSMC? It's in Taiwan, which in fact creates a geostrategic threat in two senses, whether or not it's actually a threat, but also the fact is it becomes a flashpoint with China. Would the world, all of the world, Asia, Japan, Korea, the United States and Europe all be better off if there was an advanced semiconductor production facility, one in Europe and one in the United States, relieving that geostrategic pressure? Absolutely. So the question is, how do you accomplish that? A related question to that is, and Laura's pointed to this, which is the thing blocking a lot of that development is that it takes an enormous amount of semiconductor talent. One of our good friends, Laura has in mind, Stu Feldman, who in fact once remarked that, you know, an advanced semiconductor facility, truly cutting edge facility, is pure magic. Because nobody really knows how they work until they work. And then once they work, they can standardize it and you can in fact move them around. So moving a 7-nanometer fab to Arizona is perfectly possible because it's standard by now. So in fact, when we hear about Huawei, there's some debate about what's actually in their chip, but setting that aside, they are 2 generations at least still behind, because 3-nanometer, 5-nanometer and 3-nanometer chips are actually in production, which is in fact that 2 generation. It is an issue because the Chinese will move as quickly as possible, but in fact, this is a very rapidly moving game with some major Western players, Apple being one, NVIDIA above all being another, that really have massive interests in accelerating the pace at which one generation after another takes place.
Samsung.
Well, the problem with Samsung is that Samsung is also an equipment supplier. That is, NVIDIA, TSMC is a pure chip supplier. So the great question, if you're actually a user of chips, is Samsung basically going to take your design and implement it in its products? So you need pure, if you could break it off in that way, but that's a separate question. I see at least one question in the audience about this, but I'll leave it to Steve to decide who to call.
So thanks so much. I'm super interested in the coalition building, green spiral, and kind of winner picking dynamics that some of you have discussed throughout the panels. So if you kind of got an environment where you're doing modern industrial policy and you're selecting a core set of industries where you think it's an important national security priority or political or economic priority for a national economy to be really successful in those areas, how do you, both on the theoretical level and like as a practical policymaker, deal with the risk of the political kind of negative knock-on effects of picking winners that turn out not to win in some cases? So I'm thinking of kind of Solyndra, interim standard offer contracts in California in the so I'm thinking in the context of the IRA, maybe if you think if you believe that there are a lot of applications for hydrogen that are being put out there by the industry right now, where particularly for some classes of transportation and heating uses, they may not be kind of the most economic ones, but they're kind of at a unique political juncture of interests. How do you think about kind of the trade-off between including things that may not be ultimately the most successful because you need them for the political coalition building to get a deal done today, versus the political costs that may impose in the future when your policy turns out to have selected something that may impose higher costs and bring lower benefits than you might have imagined at the start?
Well, sorry. A very simple, quick answer to that is any government should act as a venture capitalist. If it does, it takes equity in any of the investments it's making. And in fact, had Solyndra set us alongside Tesla, we'd come out way ahead. The investments that were made in the rescue of General Motors, similarly, we just have a political problem with taking equity stakes. So in fact, I don't think it's do you pick winners or losers? It's you take a portfolio and you have to be able to take equity interest. That means you trust the administrative state, which makes it impossible.
All right, we're running short on time, so let's make one last question and then we'll call it a day. The panel votes for 2. Okay. Then the panel has to answer succinctly.
All the questions together.
Do quick rapid fire.
Okay. I'm gonna put this one to Todd or Kate, perhaps. So we've sort of taken in the international section here the assumption that we're mostly talking about international questions when it relates to allies, and perhaps really just distributing the benefits of, innovation among the G7 nations, like so to speak. But if we're embracing a new international order, perhaps, or a new economic doctrine, I mean, one of the key problems of the prior economic doctrine has been failing to integrate any sort of, robust, equitable development strategy for the global South. And China is clearly doing more to invest in the build out of industry more than the United States. How are we supposed to balance this? I mean, especially as folks who are interested in industrial policy in the domestic sense, can be excited about what's happening here, but if it's to the exclusion of building an equitable industrial ecosystem out there in the world and shutting down countries in the semi-periphery that are trying to build their own domestic supply chains, how do we integrate an internationalist perspective into our domestic industrial policy? Sorry to put that to you, Todd. Anyone else?
So we've witnessed in the last 2 years a very dramatic energy transition, not necessarily a clean energy transition in Europe. And that's as a result of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We've seen a complete use of industrial policy to restructure European energy markets in a very profound way. And does that offer us any lessons about, first, cooperation with allies, and second, of how we use the tools of industrial policy to very rapidly conduct a transition like this? And I think multiple people on this panel would be great to address that.
All right, so Todd, why don't you take the first question and then we'll see who wants to take the second.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a key question. Like I said, I think that there are visions and resources from the past that would involve a more equitable developmentalist approach to all these questions. I think we should take them very seriously. I think that like some of the key test of whether the administration is really has there is an internationalist version of Bidenomics. I'm going to be looking very closely as to like whether the folks at USTR and the trade agencies, whether they start suing over other countries' green industrial policies, which is like what as recently as the Obama administration and Trump was kind of the norm over there. So I think that, if we believe in policy, that policy space is important for us, we should also believe that policy space is important for other countries. But I do think that you have to sort of separate out the China challenge as kind of something that's somewhat historically and comparatively unique. After all, I mean, we've spent decades very concerned about sort of the 40% control of petroleum that OPEC controls, and that's been sort of a guiding force around a lot of international politics. If you look at sort of the level of concentration in the green energy supply chains for China, it's in some cases over 90 or 95%. So it's an extremely acute security question that I think that just kind of deserves sort of above and beyond sort of the specific sort of developmentalist posture the U.S. should take vis-a-vis other emerging markets. It's just that China does present some sort of unique problems that I'm not surprised the administration struggles to come up with answers to.
I go super fast on that one. Just you can't ignore the global South because of a lot of reasons, but a big one on the climate side is that if you do, then you just get a massive amount of new coal development. I mean, a lot of our cooperation with South Africa, with Indonesia, with India, with a lot of places has been around this just transition question of how do you actually transition away from coal and not build new coal, because you just go backwards on everything else we're talking about if that happens. So it's incredibly important because climate is a global issue. I think there's a lot of really important questions about how to do it and whether we go back to your earlier question to, sort of classic models of, frankly, putting countries in more and more debt, which has been how we've generally done this. Not necessarily a great answer to this question. The Just Energy Transition Plan is a little bit like that. So I think there's a real question around that, but I think it's super important and needs a lot of study. I am very worried about disinvestment in some of those places because of physical climate impacts. They're high risk places to invest. And I think that's important to pay attention to. And then quickly on the coalition question, I think one of the ways you do that, we should not be investing in things that won't survive after subsidy. We should be actually very thoughtful about how these investments are going to play out over the long term. And that means asking companies to tell us where they sit in the global ecosystem, why they're competitive, why the place they've chosen is the right place to do this project, how it's going to last, what the plan is, right, for the long-term play. That's not something we did. And Celinda is a really interesting example we could talk about all day, but we did that investment at the same time we did a massive amount of investment in overseas solar development. And then we were like, but you do it here and see how that works out, right? I mean, that's really a problematic approach and not one that we would take in a sort of a more thoughtful economic and industrial strategy. So that's my only other answer.
Does anybody want to take on the question about European energy markets? Fantastic. I realize we didn't get to all of the questions. Really special thank you to all of you for coming, for staying this late, and for some great questions.